My son is but 4 years of age, and I, his mother, have lived 6 and 20 winters. Yet this morning, beneath the pale, watery light of an Appalachian dawn, he whispered a horror that has turned my blood to ash. He told me, with the flat, unblinking solemnity of the very young, that his ghost brother, the silent companion who walks the drafty corridors of our newly acquired estate, had commanded him to take my life. Let it be known that my child is no seeker of the grotesque. His mind is occupied by the fossilized giants of the primeval earth. He knows only the innocent tales of ancient, leaf-eating beasts and the occasional marvel of the modern shadow plays we watch by the hearth. 2 months ago, my fiancé and I purchased this house, a brooding structure of damp timber and gray slate nestled in the ancient, fog-shrouded folds of the mountains. From the first night, I felt the house sighing with an unnatural weight, but I did not heed the warning bells. I have lived in haunted places before. I have grown accustomed to the cold drafts that carry the scent of wet earth and old wood. But the mountains do not tolerate the casual whistling of men after the sun has slipped behind the peaks. To whistle in the dark of these high, forested ridges is an ancient transgression and invitation. The old wives say, to the hollow things that wait in the mist. It was near the half-hour past 11 on a night of suffocating silence when I heard it. A low, melodic whistling drifting up from the parlor below. "Arthur," I called out, my voice trembling as I reached for my shawl. "Cease your whistling. You know what spirits you invite across the threshold." My fiancé entered the bedchamber, his face drained of color under the flickering candlewick. "I have not breathed a single note," he whispered. I scoffed, assuming some masculine prank, and bade him go to bed. Yet the next morning, as the steam from my copper bath rose into the rafters, he came to me with a furrowed brow. "Tell me the truth of last night," he murmured, his scientific skepticism, usually so rigid and unyielding, faltering before the silence of the house. I assured him of what I had heard, and he fell quiet, dropping the matter as though it were a heated coal. For a fortnight, the manor slept. Then, 3 nights ago, while Arthur was away supervising the late shift workings in the valley, the peace was shattered. I was speaking through the newly strung telephone wire with my cousin when a tremendous crash echoed from the ground floor. It was a violent, splintering sound, as though an intruder had forced an entry through the heavy oak doors. "Stay on the wire," I whispered to my cousin, my hand clutching a heavy brass poker. I knew the folly of the heroine who descends into the dark, yet the instinct to protect my sleeping child drove me down the spiral stairs. At the landing, the parlor was empty. The moonlight cast long, skeletal shadows across the hearth. It was only when I stepped into the kitchen that I saw the source of the din. On the cold stone flagstones lay a heavy, 3-wick candle of common paraffin, cast a dozen feet from the entry table where it had sat. Beside it, a gilded portrait of my ancestors lay face down, as though struck by a heavy hand. The house is merely settling, I reasoned, though my heart beat like a trapped bird. I set the heavy jar back upon the table and tried to coax it to fall. I stomped upon the floorboards. I jumped. I struck the oak table with my fist until the wood groaned. The candle did not budge. It sat as heavy and inert as lead. The following night, as sleep began to take me, a rhythmic, earth-shaking banging commenced in the cellar beneath my feet. With Arthur once more in the valley, I descended into the damp, stone-walled passages. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and wet coal, and every hair upon my arm stood erect. I felt the unmistakable pressure of a cold, malicious eye fixed upon the nape of my neck. "I care not that you abide here," I cried into the gloom, my voice cracking with a desperate courage. "But I beg of you, cease these visitations when I am left alone." As I turned to flee, that primal, childish terror seized me, the certainty that some long-limbed horror was reaching for my skirts from the dark. I ran up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs, and locked myself within my chamber. Throughout the night, the melanistic cat we kept to clear the cellars stood sentinel at my door, her back arched, her throat vibrating with a low, continuous hiss. An hour before dawn, my son awoke, crying for the comfort of a moving lantern play. I set the light for him, but as I returned to my bed, I heard him whispering in the dark of his nursery. He has always possessed an imaginative mind, inventing vast, invisible kingdoms. But this morning, as we sat by the cold hearth, his face was devoid of all childish light. "Mommy," he said, his voice small and terribly clear, "my ghost brother says I must kill you. But I would never do such a piece of work, for I love you." When I pressed him, my throat dry as parchment, he spoke of a voice that whispered from the floorboards, commanding him to break his toys, to strangle the garden birds, to trample the wild lilies, and to pick a grave for his mother. My boy, who would weep over a crushed beetle, spoke of these horrors with a terrifying, hollow obedience. I am born of a lineage whose eyes have always been cast backward into the tomb. My childhood was spent in a crumbling, waterlogged tenement where the wind howled through the rotting pine. It was there that our neighbor, an aged widow, perished in her locked rooms. Her mute, simple-minded son sat with her decomposing remains for weeks, unaware of the transition from sleep to rot. The young woman who took the rooms after them vanished within a fortnight, leaving her gold, her garments, and her whimpering spaniel to the dust. When I was 16, we moved to a modern, 3-story villa in a prosperous parish. My chamber was on the highest floor, adjacent to the cold attic. I believed myself safe, until one evening, as I descended the stairs in search of a midnight draught of water, I looked down toward the parlor door. A woman was peeking up at me from the shadows. She was ghostly pale, her eyes stretched wide in a manic, sightless stare, her mouth curved into a rigid, toothless grin that split her face from ear to ear. Her hair hung in wet, stringy hanks like weeping willow sweeps. I froze upon the step, my breath catching in my throat. She did not appear as the translucent phantoms of my earlier dreams. She possessed the terrifying solidity of a corpse newly drawn from the river, her face etched with the deep, terrible wrinkles of the grave. Though she vanished when I blinked, the memory of her claw-like hands and that frozen, dreadful smile has haunted every dark staircase of my life. Even in my youth, when I sought the sanctuary of logic and the natural sciences, the shadow world pursued me. I recall a summer night during my university years, when I ran along the gravel paths of a Midwestern fen to clear my mind of study. To my right were the warm, gaslit windows of the suburban manors. To my left lay the black, stagnant waters of a reed-choked pond. Suddenly, a dense, brilliant sphere of white fire, the size of a child's skull, rose from the high grass. It did not drift like will-o'-the-wisp. It bounced with an unnatural, heavy cadence upon the gravel path, diving into the tick-infested reeds and returning to the path as though possessed of physical weight. It was so blindingly bright that it cast my own shadow before me, yet it left no heat behind. Terrified by its silent, rhythmic pursuit, I turned and fled back to the safety of the carriage road, my scientific mind unable to reconcile the physical density of that cold, bouncing star. Perhaps the veil was thinned further during the autumn. I spent babysitting my infant cousin Emma in her parents' newly built estate. It was a vast, hollow house of cold plaster and unpolished floors. One afternoon, while the child slept in her cradle upstairs, I heard the heavy, rhythmic tread of boots ascending the grand staircase. The timbers are merely settling, I told myself, clutching the infant to my breast. But as I stood in the kitchen, the sense of an invisible witness became so oppressive that I began to pack the diaper bag to flee. Without warning, the wireless receiver in the parlor turned itself on, screaming with a deafening, metallic static that caused the infant to shriek with terror. I ran to the carriage house and called my cousin Samantha to fetch me. While we spoke on the wire, the static erupted once more from the empty parlor. We fled to the wet grass of the front lawn and waited in the autumn chill. That evening, when we returned with Samantha and her sister, Rachel, to retrieve my belongings, the house was dark and locked. Yet, as we stood upon the porch, we heard the sound of many feet running through the upper corridors, the hollow, mocking laughter of invisible revelers echoing through the glass. We saw a shadow pass the window, turning its pale head toward us in the gloom. We knocked, we called out, believing our cousins had returned to play some cruel joke. A moment later, the lanterns of a carriage cut through the mist. It was Alyssa and Mark, just returning from the distant town. The house had been utterly empty. My cousin S. husband had spent his youth in the far-off tropical colonies of the Philippines, in a Spanish colonial manor of black mahogany that had stood vacant for a decade. He spoke of the gliding lady who haunted the barred windows of the third floor. One evening, as he walked the humid corridors, he saw her a figure in a shroud of rotting white lace, her jaw slack and disjointed, her brown hair hanging wild. She lunged toward him through the dark with impossible speed, bringing with her a biting winter chill that froze the sweat upon his brow before she vanished into the air. And what of the hairy beast of my 8th year? We lived then in a 2-story apartment with an old clawfoot tub that smelled of rust and damp copper. One morning, while my mother slept upon the horsehair sofa, I built a fort of wooden chairs in the parlor. Through the slats of the chairs, I saw a dark, low-shaped zoom past with impossible velocity. With the foolish curiosity of childhood, I sought to lure the thing from its hiding place. I laid a trail of sweet corn cake crumbs upon the steps of the staircase and hid behind the banister. 5 minutes passed in absolute silence. Then, a sharp asterisk crunch asterisk echoed from the bottom step. I looked down. Crawling up the stairs on all fours was a squat, hirsute horror the size of a young child, but covered from head to heel in coarse, grease-slicked black fur. It stopped at each step, devouring the crumbs with a wet, animal hunger. Realizing that the beast was ascending toward me, and that I was alone in the high corridor, I let out a shriek that rumbled the rafters. My mother came running, but when we looked, the beast was gone, though the crumbs on the lower steps had been swept clean. Shortly thereafter, while bathing in the old clawfoot tub, I saw a tall man standing in the steam. When I looked directly, there was only the cold plaster wall, yet the certainty that he was crouching just on the other side of the porcelain rim drove me naked and screaming into the parlor. We moved from that apartment within the month, staying in a temporary lodging where the mirrored corridor seemed to sprout pale, reaching arms and dark, cephalopod-like tentacles from the very plaster. I have seen the beautiful and the terrible alike. I recall the ancient, dilapidated cemetery in the backwoods of Georgia, where my companion and I saw a sphere of light, the size of a carriage wheel, hovering before a moss-crusted headstone. Inside its glassy shell, 2 miniature, tempestuous oceans clashed in perpetual storm, one a deep, bruised violet, the other a brilliant, electric cobalt. I was transfixed by its sublime, hypnotic beauty, but my companion's terror broke the spell, and we fled into the dusk. There were darker times, too, the year I spent in the bleak, disciplinary reformatory in the northern hills, a place of stone walls and cold iron. One night, my Jack Russell Terrier began to growl at the foot of my cot. Through the whitewashed dormitory, a 3-dimensional shadow, the perfect silhouette of a tall man, yet composed of a shifting, absolute darkness, walked silently through the wall and vanished into the stone. 2 weeks later, my guitar amplifier began to emit a low, demonic chanting, a rhythmic growling in a tongue I did not know, driving me to hide in the iron tub for hours, while the dog whimpered in the dark. And what of my mother's house, after the bitter divorce that tore our family asunder? I slept in the attic, a room directly connected to the laundry, where the wet linens hung like shrouds. The bathroom possessed 2 mirrors hung directly opposite each other, a classic spiritualist's trap, creating an infinite corridor of reflections where the soul might easily lose its way. A tall, emaciated shadow figure took up residence in my wardrobe. Whenever I quarreled with my mother, a cold, bitter woman whose body was later struck with a sudden, wasting paralysis that the doctors could never explain, the entity would stand over my bed, its cold breath smelling of dry rot. One night, after a particularly bitter dispute, a heavy iron drying rack was wrenched from its hinges and cast across my door. When I stepped out to investigate, I tripped over the bent iron, leaving a deep, weeping wound upon my leg that stained the floorboards red. The legs of the rack, forged of thick, unyielding metal, had been twisted like warm wax by some monstrous, unseen strength. I have seen the mattress beside me sink under the weight of an invisible guest, crushing the velvet face of my childhood doll, while cold needles of dread cascaded down my spine. I have seen my sister S face pressed through a heavy canvas sheet in my grandparents' basement, though the space behind the sheet was empty stone. I have heard the dual staircases of my mother's villa echo with the simultaneous footsteps of two invisible climbers. I have stood in the cold, silent stone lavatory of an empty railway station in Michigan City, where the air suddenly turned to ice, and a heavy bang like iron striking stone shook the walls. My pocket lantern flickered and failed, and the rusted iron door of an empty privy stall slowly swung open on screeching hinges, though no feet stood within. I have held a Civil War dog, stuffed with horsehair and coarse straw, and listened to the galvanic spirit telegraph speak in the double voices of dead children Juliet and Robert, only for the voices to turn condescending and cruel, whispering, *O, really *, before our cat collapsed upon the rug, choking on her own breath. I have stood in the damp forests of Oregon, at the grave of Eliza, the last daughter of an extinct tribe, and watched the smoke of my tobacco offering spiral in unnatural, tight coils before my limbs froze and a bitter, white foam spilled from my convulsing throat. I have lived in the long, rectangular house where the shadows shifted at the far end of the parlor, and some frantic, heavy thing ran up the stairs at midnight, throwing its weight against my bedchamber door with a violent, rattling blow. And I have been lost in the ruined, rubble-strewn grounds of the old camp Douglas Lazaretto, where a pale woman in a shroud paced the weed-choked paths. When I turned my head, she stepped into the tall grass, leaving only her faceless, hollow visage peeking through the briars. I remember the desperate, chanted prayers of protection I cried into the night as we fled through the broken iron palisade into the gas-lit street. Now, I sit in this high, cold room in Blackwood Manor. The wind from the Appalachian ridges rattles the window panes like dry bones. My son sleeps in his nursery, his small hands curled, his mind perhaps wandering in that dark kingdom where his ghost brother whispers of the grave. The cat stands at the threshold, her eyes fixed upon the darkness of the corridor. I hear a low, melodic whistling beginning once more at the bottom of the stairs. Arthur is away in the valley. The candle upon the mantelpiece begins to slide, inch by inch, toward the edge.
Hãy ngừng giết hại động vật. Hãy ngừng giết hại động vật.